Amen. Well, hey, last week we began a series entitled Check Your Heart. And the premise behind it is this. We all, if we're having heart issues, right, we go to a heart doctor who will then give us the test that we need to perform to see what the issue is. There are certain tests that help evaluate and help monitor the physical condition of our heart. But what we began talking about last week is it's not just the physical condition we need to be worried about. That really there's this side of the emotional and the spiritual condition of our hearts that we need to dig into. And here's why. Solomon, who is the wisest man to ever walk the face of the earth, Solomon would make this statement in Proverbs. He says, above all else, as we talked about last week, when we think about this idea of above all else, it literally means like above everything else you could possibly do, above everything else you would possibly think about doing, above all else, guard your heart. Why? For everything you do flows from it. Everything we do flows from our heart. I mean, our thoughts, our beliefs, our actions, the words we say, everything we do, it flows from the heart. And what flows out of the heart impacts our professional life. It impacts our relational life. It impacts the neighborhood. It impacts the family. It impacts the colleagues at the workplace, right? What flows out of our heart, it has significant impacts on our heart and on our life and our relationships. And last week, we showcased the first heart monitor that we talked about was this, that what you say flows from what is in your heart. That the words you say, if you want to figure out the condition of your heart, the best thing we can do is begin to evaluate and navigate what are the words that we're saying. You know, are the words that we're saying, are they from a place of anger? Are the words that we're saying, are they more critical? Are they more deceptive? The words that we say are a powerful indicator as to what we're storing inside our heart. And monitoring your words indicates what's ultimately being stored in there. And today, what I want us to do is we're going to look at the second heart monitor. We're kind of walking through and navigating how do we make sure that our hearts are in tune? How do we check our hearts? Well, the second monitor, which I'm going to here's just a warning, okay? We are going to be talking about money today. And the reason is not because like I'm going to come over here. You've seen me do this before and say, I want you to give $39.95 and we're going to give it all away. Like that's valuable. But when we think about the heart and we think about the things that grab our attention and our affection, so oftentimes it's the things that bring us pleasure. It's the stuff, it's the possessions, it's the resources, it's the money that we have that so quickly can get in the way of us being able to really have the heart that we desperately want. In fact, as it turns out, the physical heart and the spiritual heart and the emotional heart, they all have one common adversary, and it is this. It is our appetites. I mean, when you think about it, some of us have appetites that are for things that aren't very good. You just look at what's in your pantry. I'm not going to go there because I don't want you to look at my pantry because we know what's in there. And I mean, you know, regardless, right? But when we think about the appetites, we think about some of the things that we are longing for or things that we desire. And so oftentimes we see that the things that we have an appetite for, they can be very devastating on our heart. And not only that, but when we look at the spiritual and emotional condition, there are appetites within our heart that we begin navigating for that can really create some disruption or can create some inner dissonance, internal dissonance, like we talked about last week. But you know, when it comes to the cardiovascular health, one of the most challenging things is the problem is not necessarily that we don't know how to have available foods. The problem tends to be that we have a lack of discipline when it comes to the appetites that we have. We know what we need to do. We know moderation is key, but when it comes to the appetites that we have, right? Ultimately, the appetites we have, whether it's the physical, emotional, or spiritual, it has one word and it feeds the appetites, and the word is more. I want more. I want more. I need more, right? And ultimately, our appetites, they are never fully and finally satisfied. The desire for more is how the heart gets set on things, right? We get fixated on, we move in the direction of, we continue to focus on, and we become convinced that something, whatever it is the only way to satisfy the appetites that we have. We get fixated on it. And when our heart is set on something, not just wanting it, when our heart is set on actually needing something now, what happens is, well, we begin to fight for satisfaction. In fact, here's a little chart that that's fascinating, right? I love math. In fact, my boys are loving math, and it's exciting for me. We laugh about sometimes we'll just sit and do math problems, and the boys will, hey, Dad, give me another math equation. I'm like, oh my goodness, this is exciting. Anyway, but isn't it true, and you've probably experienced this, that there's certain personal problems we have, right? Like there's problems that we have that we created because there was a desire that we wanted, and we met the desire now rather than waiting for later. And because we chose to satisfy the desire now, there's a cause and effect relationship. I mean, have you ever experienced personal problems because you decided you wanted to purchase that thing, you wanted to go to that place, you wanted to do that thing now, knowing that if I do it now, there's going to be regrets later? And many of us have faced those significant problems, right? And it could have been avoidable if we would have been honest with ourselves, but isn't it hard to say no to now so that we can say yes to later? I mean, students, you probably have seen this, right? Like when your friends come, and let's just be honest, it's not just students. When your friends come with the latest and greatest iPhone, and you're like, oh my goodness, mine doesn't do all of that. And you begin to think, I need that iPhone now. I need that now. And whatever it is, whether it's the technology we have, the computers we have, the cars we drive. I mean, when you think about the 16-year-old, the car you should be driving is maybe not the car that every single 16-year-old has in your parking lot. But you want it now, and you begin to be just a crazy kid to your parents because you want something now, but you realize, or maybe you don't, your parents realize that if I get it for you now, there's going to be problems later. And ultimately, when we look at this is dangerous for our physical health, it's dangerous for our relational health, it's dangerous for us financially as well. And when we look at this is really just a graphic or a description of what instant gratification really is. I mean, if we were to define instant gratification, it's being consumed with the now and having little regard for the later. It's being consumed for the now. I want it, and I want it now, and having very little regard for the later. You see, Jesus talked about money quite a bit, and the reason he talked about it wasn't necessarily because he wanted your money. The fascinating thing is, in nearly half of Jesus' 38 parables, he referenced possessions or stuff or money. And why? Why was Jesus concerned about money? I mean, I really don't think it was because he wanted it. He wasn't running around being like, hey, can I get, hey, hold up. You know, he wasn't sitting at the street corner panhandling saying, hey, come on, I need your more money. Rather, he was leaning in and trying to encourage and champion and challenge his followers that there's something sitting on the throne of your heart. And if you're not careful, the possessions you have are going to take the place of what I have called for you. In fact, in one of Jesus' most famous messages, most famous sermons, it's Sermon on the Mount. Why? Because he preached it on a mountaintop. And there's lots of people that are listening in. And in this message, he says this: don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and where thieves can break in and steal. Well, Jesus, what should we do then? Well, he tells you, I'm glad you asked. He says, store your treasures in heaven, where moth and rust cannot destroy. I don't know if you've had moths destroy your treasures before, but I guess that was a thing back then. And thieves do not break in and steal. See, last week we talked about there's two things that we store in our heart, right? Good versus evil. And today, what I want us to talk about is where we store our treasures, right? Throughout life, there's really two places that we can store our treasures. And Jesus is talking about this. There's two places that you can store your treasures. You can either store them now on earth in this present day, or you can store them later in heaven, the age to come. And Jesus is saying, he said, now here's the deal. Here's what I want you to know. You can either store them now, or you can store them later. You can store them now in the earth, and the reward is yours, or you can choose to store them later. And you can see what can happen when you begin to sacrifice and give and allow that to flow. But isn't it true? I mean, every day we have a battle within that is waging it. I mean, we're exposed to somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 messages on a daily basis. And the variation depends upon the generation you're in and depends upon the social media you consume, right? But we are consumed with so many messages, and the messages are not sitting here saying, just wait for later, wait for later. The messages appeal to your happiness. They say, there's a problem you have, and I know a solution. The solution is now. If you do this now, it'll satisfy your desires. If you buy this now, if you drive this now, if you wear these now, if you travel there, it will make you happy now. You see, what we find is the now, the messages that we have, the messages that we lean into, they're all about living life in the moment. Living life in the moment, in the now, like right where I'm at. And Jesus is saying that, hey, listen, I want to encourage you to investigate later. Why? If we invest in later, later's actually greater. When we invest in the age to come, it can even be that much better. And he appeals to this idea of what we want most and our deepest desires and what's going on the inside. And he knows that for many of us, we want to live in the moment. We want to live in the now. We want to fight for the now. But he's trying to let you know that instead of living for the now, if we'll live for the long run, that you'll begin to see and experience a different type of life. And I realized that living for the long run is ultimately swimming upstream in our culture. You name a message that you got that said, hey, don't worry, don't buy now. There's going to be better iPhones. Don't worry about that. Buy the old one. Stick with the old one. Don't worry about that. Buy a clunky car. Like, there's very few messages that lean into the live for tomorrow. And there's a book, it's called The Road Less Traveled. And in this book, the author does a great job of kind of differentiating between the now versus the later, and how we are constantly fixated on, we're consumed with, if you will. We're consumed with what we want now. And listen to what the author said about what this looks like. He says this: delaying gratification is a process of scheduling the pain and pleasure of life in such a way as to enhance the pleasure by meeting and experiencing the pain first and getting it over with. That delayed gratification is all about scheduling our life in such a way that we choose to sacrifice. We choose to push the pain down now so that we can enjoy the joys later. That we can live through the sacrifice knowing, I know I need this now, but do I really need this now? So that when we actually get to experience it, it is that much richer. You see, these competing ideas, now versus later, now versus later, now versus later, they are fighting, and they're fighting for control of our hearts. And Jesus would say this: wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's as if Jesus knew that in our hearts, there's like a little treasure box. And in this little treasure box, right, our hearts are moving in the direction of what's in the treasure box. And our hearts are constantly on the move. And we're constantly formulating and figuring out, what do we want? What do we need? And for most of us, this isn't new. I mean, it's not difficult to know what you want in your heart, is it? But Jesus' point was this: as we begin to think about and figure this out, if you want to know what's in your heart, the best way you can do is to navigate, to think about, to ask the question, where is your treasure? In fact, Jesus says this is a determining factor of where our heart is. When we look at where our treasure is, that's the best way to see where our heart really is. In fact, Jesus would continue, and he says this: your eye your treasure. And now your eye is like a lamp that provides light for the entire body. When your eye is healthy, he says your whole body is filled with light. What he's saying is our eyes determine where our attention goes. Our eyes determine where our attention goes, and our heart is going to follow our eyes. Our heart, our will, our emotions, our mind, it's going to follow the things that we fixate our eyes upon. So Jesus is looking at them and he's saying, hey, here's what we need to think about. When you want to figure out the condition of your heart, you want to look at the treasure box and see what are you treasuring, and then next you want to look at your eyes and see what are you looking at. Pay attention to the desires. Pay attention to where your treasure goes. It's what you see tends to be where you fixate your heart on. And then Jesus goes on to say this, but when your eye is unhealthy, your whole body is filled with darkness. Jesus knows that if we are going to fixate our eyes on things that are unhealthy, if we're going to fixate our eyes on things that maybe are things that maybe could be good later, but you know you don't need it now, that when we begin to fixate our eyes on something that's not good, it doesn't just affect our eyes, but it becomes detrimental to the entire body, to the mind, the emotions, the heart. I mean, you know this, that the things we fixate on tend to be the things we dwell on. The things we look at tend to be the things that we dwell on regularly. And ultimately, what we see, the way that our eyes go, it leads us, and sometimes it leads us blindly along to what true health really looks like. Well, then Jesus continues on, and he's like, I'm not done, don't worry. No one can serve two masters, for you will either hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other, which we're like, Jesus, that sounds good, that sounds great. And then he drops this little nugget that I'm like, Jesus, why did you put that there? He says, you cannot serve God and be enslaved to money. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money, which is fascinating. Because as we look at our lives, there's the treasures we have, which oftentimes the things we treasure come from where we are fixating our eyes on, and our eyes tend to follow what has control of our heart. In fact, our heart, what Jesus is saying is our hearts have a throne. And what you put on your heart, what you allow to be king of your heart, what you allow to be king of your heart, what you let give you direction, it tends to be what leads you and guides you. In fact, if you don't choose what is king of your heart, oftentimes the world will. It will choose you. It will begin to tell you what you need and what you want, and we'll listen to all those messages, and we'll begin to think, if I don't get this, I won't be cool. If I don't get this, I won't get the job. If I don't get this, I won't be liked. You see, this is why Jesus talked about money so much. More than anything else he talked about. Why? Because money and wealth and stuff, it is so easy for us to put it on the throne of our heart. I mean, it's so easy for us to put the possessions that we want, the desires that we have. We're bombarded with Instagram pictures of everybody's perfect life, and we begin to think, how do I even begin to measure up? And so what has control of our heart? The highlight reel of the people that you don't even like. And so then they have control of your heart, and what happens? You begin to look and see that's what they do, that's how they act, that's what I need to do. And so then all of a sudden the treasures that you're trying to pursue are the very treasures that come from a place that you don't even know how it got there. You see, the most common battle when it comes to what's in our heart is fear. In fact, these are two fear tactics that often play into what is on our heart, right? It's the fear of missing out. We don't want to miss out. I mean, we say yes now because, we don't want to miss out. There's something on the other side of this yes, that if I say yes, I'll get the friends. If I say yes, I'll have the experience. If I say yes, I can always pay for it later. There's the fear of missing out, but it's not just the fear of missing out, it's the fear of running out. I mean, we become, right? We find that there could be a run on toilet paper, and so we want to make sure we don't run out of toilet paper too. So we run to the nearest grocery store, and we're like, oh no, we need to go to the next grocery. There's the fear of missing out, but then there's also the fear of running out. And both of these fears make us servants Both of these fears, if we're not careful, they will keep us from investing in God's kingdom, keep us investing in what is to come, and they put our devotion, they put our attention on what is the now, on the fear. You need to do this. If you don't do this, what will happen? If you don't do this, what's going to go? If you don't say yes right now, you might never have the opportunity again. And Jesus goes on to say later on in this passage, which I think is fascinating, he leverages what Solomon said in Proverbs, seek the kingdom of God above all else and live righteously, and he will give you everything you need above all else, just like Solomon said. I mean, when it comes to our heart, we need to protect, we need to treasure, we need to make sure that above all else we guard our heart. And Jesus is saying one of the best ways to do that is to seek his kingdom, to begin to invest in his kingdom, to say that I trust you, God, I trust you first and foremost, that I trust you to supply everything that I need, which gets us to the second heart monitor. The second heart monitor, the first one was watch the words, and the second one is this, is wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. So let me ask you, who is the king of your heart? Who are you trusting right now to provide for you? Another way of putting it is, what kingdom are you currently building? Are you building a kingdom for now? Are you building a kingdom of what you want in the moment right now? Or are you building a kingdom that leans into what Jesus is challenging you and championing you to do? You see, these are indicators when we begin to think about where our heart is. I mean, the indicators when we think about what we're treasuring, I mean, going back to our beautiful picture of our words, right? The first thing when we look at the treasure, our treasure begins to showcase the passions that we have, right? What we treasure is what we're passionate about. And our eye, it tends to show the attention. When we begin to look at our eyes, right, the eyes showcase where our attention is. What are we looking at? Where are we going? What's going on? And the throne of our heart begins to showcase, what are we devoted to? What do we see? What are we passionate about? Where's our attention going? And what are we devoted to? So students, before you leave, I want to invite you to ask this question. And I want you to talk about this in your small groups in just a moment. But what is your most treasured possession? I don't know about you, but when we think about this treasured possession, one of the best ways that you can begin to answer this, and this is a free play, right? This isn't just for students, this is adults as well. One of the best ways you can begin to think about what is the most treasured possession you have is, what don't you want your younger siblings to touch? And parents, what don't you want your kids to touch, right? Like when we begin to think about it, right? Like for me, I'll be honest, you know me and yard work, right? Like we have this love relationship. We go well together, right? And the boys, they see that and they wanted to partake in it with me. And there comes this point where I'm like, don't touch that weed eater. Like you might break it. And then all of a sudden what happens is the weed eater is more important than the relationship with my son. Now, granted, you could also say that by taking it away is saving his life. I realize that, all right? Like we won't talk about power tools. Anyway, but when you begin to think about it, like what is your most treasured possession? And why is that? Why is that your most treasured possession? And students, I want to invite you to go to your small groups at this point. And I want you to think about that and talk about it in your groups and begin to ask the question, what don't you want your little siblings to touch? So students, you're welcome to go at this point. But it also brings the question for all of us, where is your treasure? Right? I mean, Jesus taught that our treasure reveals what's in our heart. And our treasure reveals what we are truly passionate about. And here's what we find is your passion, the things that concern you, your passions oftentimes lead to sacrifice. And what are you willing to sacrifice for? Your passions oftentimes lead you to a place where you begin to think about the bigger picture and begin to lead you to a place where you begin to think, what is it that I'm willing to sacrifice my life for? In fact, we could go here and you begin to look. Your treasure showcases your passions. And what you're passionate about is ultimately what you're going to sacrifice for. I mean, just think about sports in our world today. There's a lot of passion and there's a lot of sacrifice to go to that game, to be in that world, to be in the arena, right? And I'm not knocking it. I love driving to College Station every Saturday. Like, it's awesome in the fall, not in the spring. I mean, Aggie base. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, right? What our passions, they tend to showcase what we're willing to sacrifice for. And what Jesus was trying to do is he's trying to give a shift in the value system that so many times the things that we're treasuring, the things that we are passionate about, tend to be the things of the now. And Jesus is wanting to change the direction of our heart in such a way that we would begin to see the bigger picture, and we would begin to see that a healthy heart comes from sacrificing for the things that Jesus would want you to sacrifice for. So how do you monitor your passions? Well, I'm glad you asked. I mean, I think one of the best ways you can monitor your passions is by taking an audit of what do you do with your time and what do you do with your money. One of the best ways we can see what we're passionate about, what we'll sacrifice for, is when we begin to look at, the students aren't in here, our checkbooks, right? Like, I don't know what a checkbook is anyway. It's a bill pay. Look at bill pay, whatever. But when we begin to look at our bank statements and our credit card statements, when we begin to look at what we do with our free time, what we do in the margins, it's one of the best ways to see what we're truly passionate for. I mean, how passionate are you for the things of later, for the eternal things? The second indicator, we talk about the eyes leads to the attention. Well, the second indicator kind of comes from that passion, right? It's the focus. What is your focus? What are you focused on? I mean, we have this constant comparison trap. We live in this world where it's I have versus others have. And what we see others have, it creeps in the middle. And we begin to get fixated. We begin to focus on the things of now, hoping that maybe our attention can run in that direction. And maybe we can get that. But ultimately, when we find ourselves leaning in to the now, it leads to discontentment. When we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people, it leads to discontentment. And I know there can be some pushback. Now, wait a second. Like, when it comes to discontentment, isn't it what has helped us move forward in our world today? I mean, discontentment is at the heart of capitalism, right? Like, that has helped us go further and faster. Like, there's got to be some discontentment, because it's in discontentment that we find progress, we find prosperity. But C.S. Lewis would say, when it comes to prosperity, he says, prosperity knits a man to the world. He feels that he is finding his place in it, while really it is finding its place in him. And while there's value in trying to pursue, and there's value in finding discontentment, the struggle is when we're constantly moving in the direction of prosperity, it might feel good in the moment, and it might feel virtuous because we're saving, and it might feel incredible because look at what we've done. But if we're not careful, if we don't lean into these monitors, if we don't see what we're sacrificing to, we will find that prosperity has actually knitted the world inside of us. It's chose us. You see, in discovering the secret of contentment, it's about living for later. It's about living for eternity. And comparison, this now versus contentment later, you rarely find comparison and contentment coexist. So what primarily has your attention? I mean, when you're sitting at the desk not doing what you're supposed to be doing, and you're thinking and you're dreaming of what could be, what are you thinking and dreaming about? What is it that you have your eyes fixated on? You know, this is ultimately, this is a great way, the series we talked about at the beginning of the year, What Breaks Your Heart? When you really begin to see what breaks your heart, it's a great way to begin to alter our focus, to change our focus in such a way that we begin to figure out how we can make a difference. You see, the first two are revealing, but when it comes to the final indicator, which is devotion, it's fascinating to see, because devotion is ultimately played out by what are we sacrificing for? Who are we serving in those moments? In fact, when we begin to think about this idea, right, devotion, it really just comes down to who are you serving? When it comes to who's on the throne of your life, who is on the throne of your heart? You know, the hearts of most religious people in Jesus' day, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, they were devoted to power and to prestige. They were devoted to wealth and making their own kingdom great. And what we find as you look after Jesus' life, it was the Pharisees and the Sadducees that wanted nothing to do with Jesus. Because Jesus introduced a kingdom that was completely not of this world. A kingdom that he encouraged and inspired those that followed him to choose the other route, to choose the way less traveled, to choose to sacrifice and focus and to serve the least of these, to begin to invest in the kingdom of the later, not the kingdom of the now. And what Jesus would tell us and what he was telling his disciples on a regular basis is something or someone will master you, whether it's intentionally or whether it's on purpose, or whether it just haphazardly. But if we're not careful, we've got to think about what is on the throne of our heart. Maybe it's the lifestyle that you're living, the power that you're pursuing, the status that you want to have, the comforts that you want to lean into. Maybe it's another appetite, completely different. You see, when we really begin to think about the treasure, the eyes, the throne, when we really begin to think about this, the heart monitor, that what we treasure is ultimately where our heart goes, it really begins to open the door of our hearts. And it begins to give us a countercultural way of living, a way of really checking on the heart and what is in there. The words that we say and the things that we treasure are significant things in our world today. So let me ask you these 3 questions. Where's your treasure? When you think about your life today, what is it that you're what are you paying attention to? What is your treasure that you're leaning into? I mean, our heart is constantly on the move, right? Our heart's moving in one way or the other. It is focusing in, it's leaning in, it's trying to find something new. What is it that you're treasuring? How about this? Where's your focus? What is your focus? What are your eyes fixated on? What are you constantly leaning into? Because ultimately the things we focus on will eventually be where our treasure goes. And while both of those are critical, I think this last question, it's significant. Who are you serving? Who is it that you are serving? Because Jesus made the statement, you can't serve 2 masters. You'll either love the one and hate the other. And then he goes on to say, you can't love both God and money. So who is the king of your heart? Where's your attention, your passion, your devotion go? Is it the stuff that you have? Is it the progress that you want to find? Is it the status that you want to be? Is it that you want to keep up with the Joneses? You've got this list of Instagram accounts, and these are who I want to be, and so this is what I want to do. Or are you willing to go before God open-handed and say, Jesus, I want to follow you. I want to serve you. I want the things that break your heart to break my heart. God, show me what that looks like. Because as we look at the treasures that we have, as we look at the direction of our heart, I think it's fair to say this exactly what we're about to sing. Be the Lord of my emotions. Set me free from selfish motives. Search me until there's nothing hidden, and I'll give you everything I have. You can have my heart. You see, as we close today, I want this to be our prayer. I want this to be the challenge, because at the end of the day, there's so many things in our world today, and I'm not the great, like I come before you not with, hey, here I've got everything figured out, let's walk this way. I come before you as one that's trying to figure this out. What does that look like? How do we legitimately begin to move the focus and the attention and the trust of our heart towards our Heavenly Father? Because at the end of the day, our mission is we want to inspire people to follow Jesus, not to follow the things of this world. Because what we found is the things of this world can be fleeting. The things of this world can leave you with nothing. But when we follow Jesus, we find that he really does make life better. And he makes us not richer, but he makes us better at life. Hey, would you pray with me, and then the band will lead us in one more song. God, we love you. God, we thank you so much for the fact that you're a big God. That God, in the midst of everything that's going on in our world today, God, you look past the chaos, you look past the crazy, and you find us. What a good and gracious and loving Father that would come and want to be one with us and want to lead us and guide us and direct us. And God, I confess there's so many times the things of this world, they get in the way of my affections. They get in the way of my focus. And I find myself more often sacrificing for the pleasures of this world as opposed to sacrificing for your kingdom. So God, show us what that looks like. God, may this song be our prayer. May this song be our anthem. May this song lead us and guide us as we figure out what does it look like, Father, to follow you even with our stuff. And we ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.